So here we are, we find ourselves in life, feeling ourself as part of life, having an experience of life. And everyone's experience of life is different, has different thought components, different emotions, different senses of self, different experience of being here and wanting to be here, not wanting to be here, being comfortable here, being uncomfortable here. And the comfortableness and the uncomfortableness can take many different subforms. But essentially what I'm getting at is that here we are. We're all here in life, having an experience in each moment. And that's undeniable. The experience is there. The content of the experience, whether we feel good or bad, comfortable, uncomfortable, at peace or in resistance, all of that is what we find, not what we create. And we've had a whole life of experiencing life, and generally the experience of life tends to be fairly consistent because it is an expression of how the body-mind organism, this instrument, has been shaped by life to more or less express, well, not only more or less, to exactly express as it does, or to create the experience as it does. And there's generally a consistency to that. I mean, just like a certain machine in the garden that when switched on produces a certain movement, there's a consistency to the functioning of that machine because the machine is structured a particular way and that structure doesn't change radically. And so it makes sense that it doesn't produce radically different outputs. Now, if the machine is a variable machine, has different functions or different settings, then on each different setting, the output is going to be different from that of it when the settings are different again. And humans definitely have this variability. However, the variability tends to be within a range that is the range of that machine. And so each of us, in my description here, is a biological robot, a biological machine functioning. So don't necessarily overlay the word machine with your everyday understanding of machine, because what you will think of is metal parts and simple automation. And you'll say, well, how can a machine feel? How can a machine have emotions? And hopefully, with a little bit of loosening of our thinking, loosening of our descriptions, we'll start to see that machine means functioning automatically, according to a structure, according to a design. And that the biological robot is a machine capable of producing outputs that include all of the human range of emotions, feelings, thoughts. So calling the human a machine doesn't take anything away from the life experience that we all have. It's not going to reduce the experience that we have. Hopefully what it does is it allows us to look at the experience, including the full range of human emotion and thought, and understand it differently, look at it differently, see it in a different light. See it as a output, as a result, as a functioning, as a happening, rather than something that I am creating. And the reality of the matter, or the fact of the matter, the truth of the matter, is that whether we do look at life differently or not is simply a consequence of whether the descriptions that I'm putting forward resonate, whether they take hold in the system, and then a thinking eventuates from it. And that thinking could turn into thinking that carries on for years. You might find yourself focused on a particular subtopic of what is spoken about and thinking about that for weeks. And there's something quite certain that happens is if a topic becomes important, and I'm not saying make it important, but rather if that happens to happen, because as I'm suggesting, whether we think about it or not is a result of whether the words create a subsequent movement of thought. And that's not something that I'm in control of or you're in control of. But if they do, and thinking does start to unfold over a certain topic, that after weeks of thinking about the topic in an earnest, diligent way where there is a curiosity, what we'll find is one thought and one conclusion then opens up a doorway for the subject to be contemplated in more depth. And the contemplation that I'm talking about is not necessarily just dry thinking, but hopefully it's thinking that reveal and sheds light onto a subject matter that we'll come to see is very important, and yet that maybe hasn't been explored on all of the layers that are available. And as new layers get seen, that's when we start to appreciate that there's a process happening, that the process is unfolding. And when something gets seen, it starts to go deeper and deeper. And as it goes deeper and deeper and becomes more and more automatically known to be that way without you needing to think about it, it has the effect of changing how life is interpreted on a subconscious level. It has an effect on how life is processed, not in a way where we are doing the processing, but rather the software, the hardware is changed as a result of some insight going deeper and deeper. And automatically, what is processed and the reaction, the thoughts that happen as a result of seeing something, hearing something, tasting something, smelling something, touching something, will be different to how they were before. It's akin to this notion that, once you know what your name is, and it has, because of repetitive use, become deeply, deeply ingrained that that's your name. You don't have to think about whether someone is calling your name. Your name is called, and automatically a response that knows that is your name happens without you needing to think, oh, that's my name being called. And similarly, once you return home to your house, to the place where you live and have always lived, you know simply by being in the space that you are at home because of the familiarity of it. And so that's when something has become deeply known. The same when you're driving on the roads and the traffic light goes red or green. That is known in a way where the response and the reaction to it is automatic. And so as life is seen differently, the response to life starts to become infused with that new way of processing, of seeing life, of understanding what's happening. And the old way, which is a response to life, which is based on a different way of seeing life, has to fall away to be replaced by something different. So one of the key points in the talks is that life is a happening. That thoughts happen, feelings happen, words happen, actions happen, consequences happen. And this word happen, things happen, when accompanied by a witnessing of life. And the word witnessing simply means where we start to see things as a happening. For example, we see a bird flying across the sky. And from the point of the observer, that just happened. There was no bird flying across the horizon, and then the flying across the horizon happened. There was no thought about what's for lunch, and then the thought about what's for lunch happened. You realize that you have forgotten something, which the realization, the remembering, oh, I've forgotten to put the rubbish bin out for collection. That thought is a happening, and frustration as a subsequent happening after the thought, that frustration, if it happens, is a happening. And if there is no frustration and it's, well, looks like the bin's going to be very full next week, then that is a happening too. If life can be witnessed as a happening, both the internal movements, the emotions, the feelings, the thoughts, the physical movements of the body, the speaking, and all of the external, or what we can refer to as external movements, and from another perspective of the witnessing, all of these movements are contained within the boundary of internal and external, is more relevant when we are looking at ourself and feeling ourself as the body, and if we are emphasizing this witnessing aspect that I'm speaking about, then the witnessing, when it's happening as directed, or if some changes start happening, because of some of the words that are said. The witnessing is taking place, we could say, from outside the body. Now, it isn't really necessarily outside the body, and it is. It's both. So that is a description, that's a concept, that the witnessing is happening from outside the body. And it's true and it's untrue. Much like the concept that says the sun rises and sets. It's true and it's untrue. It's what I mean by true is, let's not use the word true as in truth and absolute, but it's accurate, and at the same time it's not absolutely accurate, because we can say in practical terms, from the perspective of the person looking at the sun rises and then it sets, and we know that from another angle the sun doesn't move at all, and rather it's the earth and us being on the earth that are moving. And so the sun isn't really rising and setting. And if we don't appreciate that the sun doesn't really rise and set, but rather that the world moves, and we're lost in the illusion, or we see only one side. And if someone says, the sun doesn't really ever move, it's us that's moving, the person that's hearing that might have no frame of reference as to how that makes any sense. Let's say they've never done any science classes at school or seen any science documentaries or anything talking about the sun and the earth, and they just have their experience without anyone having told them otherwise of a sun rising and setting. It's very clear when you look at the sun at sunset. It seems very much as though the sun is moving down out of sight. And yet we know that there is a concept which is telling us that actually it is the earth that is moving, that makes it appear like the sun is setting. And so they're both correct. We can continue to use the terminology that says, that is the sun setting or the sun rising, because in practical terms that's appropriate. And at the same time, it's good for us to know that that's not really what's happening. So how's that relevant to these topics? Awareness is outside the body. Why that is said is because when witnessing happens, it feels like, just like it feels like the sun is rising and setting, it feels like awareness is outside of the body, and that the body is an object contained within the awareness that is aware of it. It feels like that, and in fact that is quite different to what the experience of perception has been set in place like. The experience of perception is that the body is seeing an external object. And there's really no question of awareness, no focus on awareness. As we have developed in life, it is just a natural process. The baby doesn't think about why they are aware of the rattle and whatever. And at the early weeks and months of the baby, it's quite possible that awareness is in this expanded state where the body isn't known to be anything particularly significant. And you can see that in some babies, if they grab hold of their own hand, they're pulling their other hand as if it was another object that has nothing to do with them. And you can also get a glimpse sometimes of the baby aware of its hand, but without it being aware that it is its hand. And over time, the sensory feedback that happens starts to set in place the idea that, oh, the body is something local to who I am, whereas the sensory feedback doesn't tell us that the rattle in the table and the other people that get touched are this. It doesn't give us the same feedback as our own body does. And so that starts to get put in place. And as that gets put in place, the sense of awareness tends to fade away and is replaced by an experience that I, the body, am the body is seeing. So awareness has now faded away out of the picture, or even the question of awareness. The body now is just seeing the world as a world of objects outside of it. And if we were to say what is seeing, what is hearing, what is touching, we essentially would answer it as parts of the body. The eyes do the seeing, the ears do the hearing, the hands do the touching, the nose does the smelling, and the tongue does the tasting. So all of those experiences, the main components of our experience, have become associated with physical functions. So the non-physical consciousness or awareness that is really the essence, let's say, the thing that is not really a thing, that is doing the awareing of our whole experience of life and always has been, has just been relegated to the realm of insignificance. And yet, it is so significant. The whole experience is dependent on this word, dependent on, can be helpful in the investigation. The whole experience is dependent on and arises in awareness. And this awareness has become considered as, or not even considered, treated as irrelevant. And by awareness, I'm not talking about your thinking about something. So that's another little pointer that sometimes gets us beyond a block where we think awareness means let me think about something. And that thinking about something or mistaking awareness to be the thinking about the book, for example, or thinking about the tree. And then we say, yeah, I'm aware of the tree because I'm looking at it going, oh, it's got a very broad trunk and rough bark and big leaves. lots of sap coming out of it. And so we often mistake looking at and thinking about, meaning commentating about all of the features, labeling the tree as being aware. So we then confuse the faculty of awareness with the faculty of thought. And if we're looking at our thinking that that is awareness, we won't bump into awareness because that is thinking. So what we think is being aware is actually thinking, not awareness. And until attention shifts away from the thinking, until that happens, then we will be essentially identified with thought, and thought is just an object. And so if we're identified with objects, the subject, and awareness we could call the subject, the subjectivity, goes unnoticed. So going back to the point that all of this experience, all of the what seem like separate objects are interdependent and not separate from awareness. So if you look at an object and you might not appreciate at first that that object only exists in your experience. I'm not saying it only exists in your experience, but it only exists as part of your experience because there is awareness of it. And so if awareness, which seems to be influenced and linked to the body, if we move our head and then we see, so now the object that was previously in the experience no longer exists as part of the experience. Because it is essentially outside of our field of awareness. And don't think about this. It needs to be experienced, and it's very easy to experience it. Because you can look at an object, or rather see that the object arises in your experience, and then the next moment the object no longer exists. And what you might become familiar with is the field of awareness that engulfs all of the objects that are in the present moment. The present moment means in your experience right now. And those objects are continually changing. You know, there are all sorts of nuances as we contemplate all sorts of things that get us to understand the moment differently. So we can say the object is never the same. It's always changing. And at first someone might, let's say they're looking at a flag on a flagpole, and they say, well, the object isn't changing, it's a flag. And so it means that their thinking about the object is very much about physicality, about a very gross interpretation of what the object is, which makes sense when you imagine not having any exposure to spiritual teachings that describe life differently. It makes sense that you will look at a mug and say, well, that mug hasn't changed. You look at the room and say, well, the room hasn't changed. And yet spiritual teachings will tell us that the experience is always changing. And as we think about that, we might find that one fine day we suddenly realize, oh, the flag, because it is moving, is never static. It's never an unchanging object. Then another way of seeing the flag as changing and never the same is to see that the flag is not really a physical object, it is an object of experience. And once there is this shift to see all of experience within awareness, we will start to see that there is really no objectively real object, but rather there is the movement, the modulation within awareness that we know as, we call the flag moving. But in fact, it's like pixels on a screen. And the pixels are just going on and off, creating different imagery. And another way to look at the flag as never the same is when we consider the micro level of the flag, and we go back to looking at it as physical, but we appreciate that physical has a micro, a quantum level, as well as the macro level, and that on a micro level, if you go down to the level of energy, the objects that we know as wood and steel and plastic are all energy in movement, and that there are atoms and molecules vibrating around and moving and changing, and it's this soup of energy. So there are many different ways that when we start contemplating, and this is an example of how the contemplation moves us from where we were at a certain point as life has developed us, and we look at a flag, we look at a mug and say, well, that's an object that doesn't change. And then we come across the teachings of Heraclitus, for example, and one of his pointers is you can never step into the same river twice. And, you know, if we look at a river and mistake the river for a name, the Thames or the Nile, and, you know, when you're driving in England and you drive past and you go, oh, there's the Thames. And then you drive past the next time, you go, there's the Thames. Well, it hasn't, it's the Thames, it was the Thames and now it's the Thames. So if we mistake words, which we do so easily because our thinking thinks in words, so we then say, well, the word is the same, it's the Thames, so it's the same river. Heraclitus is telling us you can never step into the same river twice. So we might think he means, oh, over the course of a year it changes. Like over the course of half a second, it has changed. It is flowing, it is in flux, it's in movement. Nothing is unchanging. And this thinking about this simply means we can't see the world the same way. And there can be thousands, if not tens of thousands of little insights, one after another, that get us to see life differently. And once you see that you can't step into the same river twice, then you can't not see that anymore. The old way is seen to be just a misunderstanding, an error, ignorance. But ignorance, that when we think about it, we say, well, life presented the experience of life and of learning about language and looking at things with the senses. And it created a relationship to objects, which was a relationship that said the object is outside of me and the object is unchanging. And we realize it's only until, or it's not until, life delivers new conditioning that says, look at it differently. It says no one has pointed out that the table is in complete flux all of the time. It's never the same. If you had a set of glasses that allowed you to see on the micro level, you would see the table is like the river that is continually changing. And yet some objects with our eyes are not able to be seen, like the river is continually changing. If we move to the perception of life as all experience within the field of awareness, then and realize that everything is like pixels on a screen, that what we see are essentially pixels on the screen of awareness, that there is no objective object, there is a screen that is continually changing. We've all seen those signs, what is it? The big signboards that are essentially lights, so flashing lights and LED lights. I'm sure you've seen light setups that look like maybe arrows are going across the screen. Maybe indicators of a car, so some fancy indicator of a car might be arrows pointing in the direction that the car is going, and it looks like there are arrows moving across the light panel. And in fact, what we know, if we've looked at it closely, is that there are a whole lot of lights going on and off in such a sequence that it makes it look like there are arrows moving across the panel. So the appearance is that there are arrows, an actual arrow moving across a area of space. And when we understand what is happening, we realize there isn't an actual arrow. There is a change in the pixels that create the impression of a objective single arrow or many arrows moving across the panel. And let's start seeing life like that, that just moving, the moving of the tree may be a whole movement of pixels rather than the movement of a tree in a physically real world of form. And yet, the teaching is not saying that in the end we will not relate to the world as a world of form. It's not saying that we will not relate to the tree as if it has 3 dimensions within a 3-dimensional world. That also becomes correct and becomes how we live life. However, this phase, which is retraining ourselves to see what our brain has created and only knows one way, as a bunch of separate objects in a world of time and space, that when known that way means awareness is overlooked. For a while, we need to break that way of seeing life and appreciate that all of life arises within this field of awareness, and that the objects are not true, they're not real, because they are always changing. They come and they go. What remains is the background of awareness. So if a bird is not there and then it comes into the field of awareness and then it leaves, the object, the bird, comes and it goes. Sound comes and it goes. Thoughts come and go. Feelings come and go. What is it that is aware of all of that? And that awareness is not going to be known by thinking the answer. And it's there for you to play with. Essentially, for you to play with means to inquire to where is this awareness, this background that is the field in which the whole experience of the world arises, an awareness that we realize is what the experience is essentially made of, and an awareness that is aware of the experience that is made and arises of and within awareness. And because it's there every moment, it's an opportunity for us to drop back into and rest as awareness. And the movement of dropping into awareness, which is out of thinking, is so unfamiliar with how we have been designed up to a certain point in time to function. Our design has been to think about, to find answers in our thinking. We go to thinking. And awareness is known when we drop out of thinking, where we realize that thinking is never going to know what I'm pointing at this point in time. Thinking is never going to be able to be awareness. Knowing oneself as awareness, which is, that is a concept. It's not what I would say is the absolute truth. I would just as easily, and in fact prefer the notion that what we are is a human being, not awareness, or we are a person. We are a person that has lost touch with the awareness aspect of the person. And when we know ourselves as a person fully, what becomes very obvious is the awareness aspect, which is very much part of the person, the human being. So all human beings are conscious human beings, meaning aware, have awareness flowing through them. And when that awareness is overlooked, life becomes very, it loses its depth. It loses, and in losing depth, it loses self. The loss of depth means the loss of knowing one's self. And what knowing oneself is replaced with is the thinking of oneself, which becomes the self-conscious self, the insecure self, the self that knows itself according to achievements or how it grew up, what its history was, how it should and shouldn't live. So all of these rules about who I am, where I've come from, what's important, which is the realm of the conceptual self. And what we find is that the human being has a core, and it's always there. We can't be human, we can't be a human being without consciousness, without awareness. And yet, even there, it's there every moment. It's overlooked. And to come in contact with that and to start resting there, to start feeling that as my home, which means to reconnect with that dimension, the human being, where we can find ourselves dropping out of thinking and just being. It's not dissimilar to having been on your feet day after day after day, and then someone showing you a chair, offering you a chair, and you sit down and you think, how nice a chair to sit down in. So returning back to being outside of, dropping out of thinking into being, can be like that, such a relief. And at first, it can feel like bliss. The contrast of being lost in thinking, which is the self-identification, the self-image that is disconnected from the true essence, the true self. The contrast between that disconnection, that identification with the conceptual sense of self, and then returning home. The difference in feeling can be what we call bliss. It isn't really bliss when we start to see what's happening. It's really a feeling that feels like it's the contrast between the struggle, the not knowing oneself, the uncomfortableness, the disconnection, compared to the relief and the stopping and the relaxation and the direct being of oneself. And the contrast is something similar to, let's say, having a very strong headache and then the headache stopping, or having a fever and feeling very sick and weak and then that stopping and going back to normal health. And that contrast is, this is bliss. Bliss relative to feeling weak. But in and of itself, it's not bliss. In and of itself, it's what you could call the natural state. That the illness is the unnatural state. And you return back to what is your baseline. So this not knowing oneself, experiencing life as a world of form where we are a separate object, know ourselves as an object only, is the unnatural state. The common unnatural state. The state in which life has sort of forced us. It has forced us to go through a particular set of tunnels. That is the development process. And intuitively, we have a sense that there is more, that something's not quite right. And it's that intuitive sense that inspires the seeking. The seeking for truth. And truth could just be a representation of, I want to know who I really am, having lost myself in thought. And intuitively there is a sense that something is missing. Something is covered up. I don't know myself. And I'm describing it as the thinking creates the thought-based sense of self, which is completely disconnected from the actual being. That is the other aspect of the awareness component. So we can then bundle this being and awareness and call that consciousness. So the two aspects of consciousness are being and awareness. And you can see that, if you like, you can look at it in two ways. You can say there is a body in an actual world, and that body is a conscious body. And because it's a conscious body, it gets to experience the world. And so the experience you have in each moment, your daily life experience, is the modulation, the representation of the world within your field of consciousness. So the experience of the world is always an experience within consciousness. One way is of looking at it, and ultimately what you want is not it to be this way or that way, but to see that the two different descriptions I'm putting forward are both true and complementary. They're two sides of the coin. So there is a body in an objective world, and that body is a conscious body, and because it's a conscious body, it has a conscious experience of the world, but that experience of the world, the experience of the books and the lamps and the table and the chairs and the other people, not the experience of the objective world, but an experience which is an experience of a world of form. But it is not the world of form, but rather our representation, our created representation of the world that is theoretically out there. So all of the objects are arising within the human being's consciousness. The other aspect we can take is that consciousness is God. Consciousness is not a human being. It is not an aspect of the human being. Consciousness is that in which the whole universe arises. And universe in practical terms means the momentary experience that is happening right now. So this is more of the traditional Advaita Vedanta says awareness is not the awareness of a body. That is the illusion. That is the misperception. Awareness is the awareness of Source. It is God having the experience of life. And in order for God to experience life in itself, God had to imagine this world of form into existence within itself. And God is described as consciousness. And from that perspective, once again, life is described as an experience, as an arising in consciousness, as an arising in consciousness, made of consciousness, witnessed by consciousness. All there is consciousness. This is the oneness of non-duality. There is just consciousness. The tree is consciousness, the other people are consciousness, this body is consciousness. And consciousness is Source. And there is nothing other than Source. So spirituality describes things in order to bring about change. Now, whether we describe a human being that is conscious and then there is an experience of a world within the human's consciousness, or say it is all arising in the consciousness of God, is frankly irrelevant. It might seem, someone would say, what do you mean it's irrelevant? They're radically different if it's all arising in God or if it's arising in the consciousness of the human being. It's very different. It's very different if we miss the point. It's very different if we think that what is important to know is whether it is God's consciousness, the universal Brahman, all there is, or whether it is the human consciousness. If we think that's the point, if we think that's what's important, if we think that's where liberation is to be found, then we'll say, well, which one is it? If you look at it differently and you say, oh, I wonder if the Advaita concept is there just to create a recognition of awareness, and that describing it all as an arising within the awareness of God is very effective at reframing how life is known. And what often happens is there will be an awakening experience, which really denotes a realization that this world of form is not really a world of form, but rather an experience of form that then is experienced as if it is a world of form. And so the awakening is a realization that the whole world arises within consciousness, which previously wasn't. And what we mean by the whole world is really our experience of the world arises within consciousness. And that awakening is essentially what is described as a shift. And it means that the world is witnessed from a perspective different to where it was seen before from. So the view of the world, when this shift happens, becomes wider. It becomes a perspective that is more encompassing, that allows us to know everything as one, one experience, one arising within one consciousness. And if these words are heard with the brain, we'll think, oh yes, it's all arising within one consciousness. And we'll have an idea of that what one consciousness is. And usually the idea of one consciousness is, some idea of God. And maybe one day I will know that one God. But what it really is pointing at, the realization is, it's all arising within one consciousness, which is, there is just your experience. The world is just the room you happen to be in this moment, if you happen to be in a room, or the world is the beach you happen to be on with the sky and the sun, or the room is the world or the universe is the car you're in. It's your momentary experience is the universe. And if we look at the universe as being something theoretical, something big, something out there, and then we keep thinking of the universe as arising in consciousness, we're disconnected from the here and now, where we will know the consciousness or the awareness in which the whole universe arises, because we're thinking about a theoretical universe arising in a theoretical oneness, in a theoretical single consciousness. So this single consciousness is, if we think about it and have some image of, oh, there is a single consciousness functioning through you and through I, then that's a notion of it. Let's bump into that consciousness, and that consciousness is the consciousness that is the presence in this present moment. So, enough said. Hello, Mark.
Hello. Good evening.
Hi there.
Good evening, all. Awareness. Yes, say aware for all. When I rest in awareness, and then with a sense of beauty, of calm, of open essence of being, when I'm essencing, the question can arise, and perhaps lately it often does. How would I know if this essencing, this intelligencing of knowing this source of existence, how would I know that this is primary or mind's perception of that?
Right. Was that a question?
It was. Yeah, best I could do in the moment.
Yeah, no, it was phrased as a question, but I didn't want to go ahead and answer something that was rhetorical, let's say.
No. It's a serious question. I mean, if you can relate, I assume, to being as, so to speak, clear, clean, and open. Perhaps 4 a.m. after some so-called unconsciousness, just clear and clean. And if that sort of direction of attention was perhaps where you were before you lost consciousness. You can arise from that space of nothing and be with that, and can come a question. Am I remaining here as if there is some treasure, or is mine just playing tricks?
Yeah,
That's
so just
that's
to
supposedly the same question.
yeah, so just to repose it in a way, maybe for those listening, it's, do I know that all of this is arising in the mind of God, or consciousness, all there is, the consciousness of Source, as an appearance, as a dream, and when there is stillness and silence, that I know myself as the consciousness of Source aware of the dream? Or is am I a human being in a world, and the world is arising within the human being consciousness, and the mind is playing tricks, telling me that I am knowing myself as the source that is all there is, aware of the dream arising within it? Would that
I'm
be
not. I'm not. I'm not
okay
sure. That's
summation?
exactly. I'm not. I know. Maybe it was just too many words for me, but um, perhaps perhaps years and years of practicing has the question, um, is this a good use of attention? Perhaps somewhere
Well,
is that question. If the point, if the space, if the universing that is occurring in that most absent moment at 4 a.m., fresh from unconsciousness, is a worthy, the other words mess it up, a worthy um, training of awareness in this space, or is it just again an object? Because I guess I conclude it must be an object because it's got my attention.
well, if you recognize that your attention is not necessarily separate from that which is aware of whatever there's awareness of, then that can fall away. The fact, because we can separate attention and awareness out and treat them as separate, but rather attention can be referred to as focused awareness, let's say. And so if we are just aware at, when you're waking up or any time during the day, and there is just a substitution of thinking and processing the world and knowing oneself through the lens of thinking, linear thinking, time-based thinking, past, future, outcomes, and I am a person in a world that needs to do this and get somewhere, which is the standard narrative. And then on top of that, I've done such a great job in the past, or I haven't done a great job in the past. What happens if the future turns out this way? So all of that thinking. And if at any point in time it can be substituted for a more primal resting in being, I think that's a great use of one's whatever you want to call it, time, attention, focus, practice, because it is essentially strengthening the muscle, the move from continually thinking about life into being. Now, accompanying that state of being and having some story about what it is, like as I described before, the mind of God in which the whole universe arises much like a dream, that narrative might help that shift. But at some point, we might ask, do I know, like your question, do I know that this is the mind of God? Is there such a thing as the mind of God? And a concept that proved helpful may at some point be seen to have to be let go of because it is just another belief. And letting go of it because it's another belief doesn't mean we have to find the being change. We can continue to rest in being without the story of it being the being, of God knowing itself. I tend to prefer at the moment, and for quite a long time, the notion that resting in being means resting in a dimension of my humanness that makes life a meaningful, worthwhile, and free of discomfort with oneself. So rather than some narrative about knowing myself as consciousness, universal consciousness or universal awareness, I now look at that experience that feels very impersonal because certain faculties of thinking and identifying with the body have fallen away. I rather look at that state of impersonal awareness as being a resting in a dimension of the human that had been previously overlooked.
That has contributed to some movement. Yes, I appreciate. You used the term, I think you used a term about linear thinking or logic. Maybe in the past you've mentioned solving problem. I forgot that I tend to label it as the critical mind because it seems to even have such a question. How would you know this is it? Is a critical mind. So the best you can do in the moment is notice that's arising.
Yes, and that's why it's important to know what it is. So, in the framework, we describe it as something very practical, rather than it being something metaphysical. So it in the teaching is peace of mind in daily living. So if you find yourself resting in being and there is peace of mind, the absence of suffering. So peace of mind means, the non-arising of suffering. Then, at least from relative to that concept, you can say, oh, this is it. This is peace of mind. And the framework also says what we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not, is peace of mind in daily living. peace of mind for the human being, peace of mind in this life. We're not interested in peace of mind in some, other life. Let the other Roger deal with peace of mind in the other life. I'm interested in happiness for Roger in this life.
I guess
Thanks,
the
Mark.
other, well, could I add this last part?
Sure.
The other thought that came to me, I guess, in answer to my question as you were speaking, is when that critical salt on the mashed potato seasons the moment by asking, how would I know this is it? Another thought comes up and says, well, whether or not this is it, what's wrong with this?
Mm-hmm.
Which is almost a variation of Sailor Bob's without a thought about it. What's wrong with this moment?
Right. Yeah.
And that actually, if it does calm the need to salt the potato, is really a quite sufficient question. Really, is there anything to complain about this gorgeous moment?
Yeah, that's right. So that almost is like saying, um, am I looking for? Are we really looking for it?
Hmm.
Um, because if we realize that maybe we're not looking for it, that there is no it, um, then that dissolves the question,
It does.
um, which I think is a derivation of what you just said.
Super. I love you. I love us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I uh, I love us all too. Hello, Holger.
Hello, Roger. Mark is so poetic. It's wonderful.
Thanks.
I would like to discuss with you what is beyond the beyond, beyond the beyond, because this is really important. I'm just joking right now, and I'm really grateful for your teaching and for your presence. And it's amazing what this. I cannot describe it, but it's.
I'm glad you were joking. Because I was gonna tell you I can't tell you what's beyond the beyond the beyond. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. It's really our natural state,
Mm.
and it's so simple.
Yeah, indeed.
Wow, party time. And I really suffered so much. I mean, for so many decades. I'm now 54, according to the numbers. And I always had so much discomfort in myself. And I didn't know how to address it and where to go. And it was horrible. And now to see that it's so simple, it's quite interesting.
Mm. What did you find um, the changes?
Um, just much more inner space, relaxing, and this should, would, could, just very much relaxing. And this fear of dying, of disappearing, of doing something wrong, of destroying, of whatever, all this is just gone right now. It just feels like an open space, like,
Mm.
yeah. And it's not, yeah, whatever, blah, blah. I could talk forever. I just wanted to say thank you, and it's really wonderful, beautiful, and thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Holger. Hello, Martin.
Hi, Roger.
I was thinking about you the other day in the car.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I thought I'll have to mention this to you next time we speak. Because I
Yes.
was remembering one of our previous talks that where you really had me in stitches. I don't know if you if you realized, and it was such a blind spot in a way, that I thought I have to mention it. And if I didn't have this thought, I wouldn't have mentioned it. But I did have the thought, so I'll mention it.
Yes,
Um,
good.
you, I hope I don't embarrass you. Do you think
No,
I'll
not at all.
embarrass you?
I don't mind.
No.
You know, no, I'm very interested in what you got to say, Roger.
Okay, because the time you had me in stitches was this, where you were um, I think you were describing a woman or several people that were complaining,
Yes.
right? And as you were describing them, it was a bit of a complaint
Yes.
about their complaining, and I don't think you could see it, and it
No.
was just so hilarious. So, but I'm if you could, if I knew which satsang it was, I wanted to refer you back to it because I started laughing in the car, and
I remember. Yeah,
because
it
I was
is.
thinking of I was thinking about these blind spots, you see, that we have,
Yes.
that we get to see, for example, that the other person is complaining, and we see, what's the point of spending life complaining? And yet, because we're seeing something and it's going deeper and deeper, we might not see our own complaining about the complaining until we do, and then we say, "Oh, I've seen you. You shouldn't spend your life complaining." And here I am complaining about the complaining, and then that stops. And it's I was thinking about it being such a wonderful metaphor about how the understanding goes deeper and deeper, slowly, not necessarily all in one shift. The different
It can't
layers
happen.
get revealed bit by bit.
Yeah, I think that's what I said to you recently, that I've now realized that the if you like, the answers don't come all together. There is not. I remember me saying that recently, that
Yeah,
we get all these knots, if you like to call them that, internally, and expect there to be one teaching, one message that can undo all the knots. And these accumulations can only be undone by an accumulation of new information. If you get that.
exactly. Yeah.
But what I wanted to ask you today, it's quite interesting what you're saying today about our disconnection from self, or from our
Mhm.
true essence, or from consciousness, part of being the universe, God or whatever. It suddenly reminded me of he's a Hungarian Canadian called Gabor Mate. I don't know if you come across Gabor Mate. He's a but
Is he a trauma? Is he a trauma therapist?
Yeah, he is a trauma therapist, and his background, to frame it, I'll try and keep this as brief as I can, but I think it's probably important. But Gabor Mate was born during the Nazi occupation of Hungary. He was Jewish, and his mother rang the doctor and said, he won't stop crying, what do I do? And the doctor said to his mother, all the Jewish babies are crying. And it suddenly occurred, and he talks about being, because of trauma, we become disconnected from our true self, from our essence. And I just wonder what your view on that is. It's very often the environment in which we find ourselves as very, very young children or babies, or even before we're born, this environment of suffering. It suddenly occurred to me, the Buddha said there is suffering. We're surrounded by suffering, as I was in that cafe that day. I couldn't understand what, and then realized I was suffering myself. And I just, that's a very long question, this, isn't it? But it's, you talk about biological reactions in the body, Gabor Mate, and they talk about the nervous system being set similar circumstances. I don't think I've ever been connected to my true self until recently. I actually discovered this internal space of peace where I can fall into it or step into it. But I just wonder if you could comment on that, Gab, being disconnected from our true self. These sort of, if that makes. I'd be very interested in your view of that, Roger.
So what tends to happen is that if circumstance is painful, our interpretation of that, based on how humans have generally formed as part of the natural development process, both within the development of an individual person from being born through infancy and then being a child and adolescent, etc., and adult. There's that process, and also the greater evolution process as to where we are now. Our sense of self, the sort of, what would we say, the communal sense of self, is such that when circumstance is painful, it's taken very personally, and then it strengthens that personal sense of self. And what it puts in place is essentially a wounded sense of self that is quite afraid of life because of a circumstance that has warranted that. And so the combination of the painful circumstance and our sense of how we know ourselves in the world creates this trauma, this fear, essentially. It strengthens the notion that who I am has been and can be neglected, unloved, hurt, the victim of cruelty. And the truth is that life on a circumstantial level has delivered a lot of that, from natural calamities to human tragedy and cruelty. So it's not unrealistic for us to explain trauma, because circumstances has been quite traumatic. Now, the important part is this: what it does, what it creates, the sense, how it strengthens the sense of self into a fear-based idea or fear-based experience. And I think the best way I could describe it is if we look at a minority group that has been oppressed. So take a lot of indigenous communities, and we can see that, whatever explorers from the West, whatever, come into a country and they have guns. This is going back into, they have guns, they need territory. They see the inhabitants as a pest, as an obstacle, so they enslave them, they kill them. There's wars just to get territory. So that's life. It's also quite tragic. And then those populations feel quite rightly oppressed, maybe discriminated against, and all of that is traumatic. And so if you take that person and you ask them to debate or to put forward a solution in around the topic, what you're going to see is a disaster unfolding, right? Because that person is oppressed, is traumatized by circumstance, and so they're not going to be able to sit down and look at the situation rationally. What's going to happen is all their anger, all their fear is going to come out in the discussion, and the other party is going to go into a defense and whatever and attack what is seen as their enemy. So the two parties of this dynamic are basically polarized and traumatized. Not only the oppressed, but in a way the oppressor as well, because they've just become enemies and competitors and rivals, and they're fighting. And so there's a separation that has happened. And so the important part is to look at, especially the oppressed, if you ask them to come up with a good solution, they can't really, because there isn't rationality there. There's anger and fear, which is, this is not a judgment of me. This is me explaining how trauma works. So the best solution would be from someone outside that isn't traumatized, that isn't involved, and can look at the situation objectively and maybe say, this is what happened, this might be a solution. And that person who is not involved and is outside and objective is sort of a representation of our self, our true self, when the trauma has been resolved, has been released from the system. And until that's the case, we're in the position where we can't actually be in flow with life, because we've got the built-up sense of self and attitude to life, which is an attitude of having to fight, for example. So until we know ourselves differently, which really means, so you can see that the oppressed person, the traumatized person, compared to the person who is objective and not involved, they're two different people. And the spiritual process can turn us into essentially a different person when that doership and attachment to outcome trauma is released from the system. And then when that has happened, we essentially have shifted from being the traumatized person with a particular sense of self, a specific identity as, the one oppressed, and we've sort of shifted to a neutral position where that's not who we are anymore. It's been let out of the system, and we can sort of move on and let the past be the past. And it's a process. It's something that can happen. And until it happens, then the human is forced to be there in life, looking at the other as a competitor, as a rival, as an enemy, as someone we have to defend ourselves from, because in any moment they can inflict, pain on us. And it's only when we come to know ourselves in the inner part of ourselves that these events of the past that essentially affected not the inner part of ourselves start to fade away, fall away. So that's why it's so important to rest in this dimension of ourself, because that's where we get to get glimpses and become more familiar with this part of ourself that is outside of any stories of being a victim, and know ourselves, know the part of ourselves that can't ever be a victim.
Yeah, that's a very interesting concept, Roger. See, what occurred to me is that very highly traumatized people, I think the earlier you're traumatized, the more fear-based you become as an entity, as a human being, is that we are then taught to look to others, particularly money, and maybe even status, that we then feel safe, or safer from what you described as potential attack by life.
Exactly.
Yes, it's just so interesting, Roger, to hear you talk and to get another perception on things. This to get a clearer view. But yeah, and I'm glad I made you laugh. It's quite funny, isn't it? I think that's one of the things that I did as a youngster. Is I just became what somebody described as a song and dance man. And I built an entire career on making other people laugh and entertain them, but at the same time was able to manipulate them to get what I needed, which was material things, really, and approbation and things like that, which I felt was necessary for my survival. So yeah, it's always a pleasure, Roger. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin. Nice speaking with you. Okay, we'll just take this last question. John, hi.
Hi there, Roger. Thank you very much for taking my question. It's related to blind spots. I need some help with, and I think it's a practical, very practical question in the end, and I hope I can keep it short. It's related to the idea of actions, life being a happening, and actions are simply happening, which I have learned a lot from, and I apply in my daily living, and I find it tremendously helpful in my relationships with people, because I can let them off the hook quite easily. However, I have a little bit of a question about a bit of a problem with letting myself off the hook, and I use this kind of reasoning, and this is where I was hoping you might be able to see where the thinking is tripping me up. I say to myself, when I intend to lift my arm, my arm can lift. I can make it lift. I can raise my arm, and so I keep using this reasoning to try to convince myself that I am the doer of my actions, because it never seems to work the other way around. In other words, my arm doesn't seem to fly up in the air without an intention preceding it. So I'm kind of wondering if you could help me unpick this reasoning that I'm using to keep myself trapped in doing.
Yeah, so if you ask yourself, where does the intention come from that leads to the arm rising, you may have something else to look at, because what happens is we tend to look at a thought that says, I can move my hand to the right, and we do it. And so we say, see, that means I'm the doer. But that's because we've assumed that thought was my doing, and therefore the subsequent action must be a response to the thought which was me. So what we have to look at is, where did that thought come from? And you'll find that the thought arose when you weren't thinking about that subject. For example, at the first part, you weren't thinking about that subject, and then you started thinking about the subject. And as a consequence of thinking about the subject, at some point the thought was, but I can move my hand to the right when I want to. Which we're very good at putting circles around events and thoughts and saying, oh, well, that's when it started and that's when it finished. And in fact, that thought was part of a greater conversation in your head about doership, let's say. And that greater conversation about doership started at a particular point. And if you look at it, you see you didn't start it, but it started. And then we say, I started thinking about it. But rather, when you look at it, you see thinking happened. We then claim ownership over thinking because it's just become how we know ourselves, right? I created the thought. Whereas the thought either just popped out of nowhere, or you saw something, heard something, smelt something, tasted something, touched something that inspired that thinking. And even if we didn't see something, hear something, smell something, taste something, touch something, which are all things out of our control. So, if someone walked across in front of you and they were wearing a big hat, and that hat inspired a thought about a play that you saw, you might then be able to see, oh, that thought about the play didn't happen because I decided to start thinking about the play that I saw, but rather something in the environment that I wasn't in control was seen, and that then inspired the thinking. And even if it's not as clear as that, inspired by, an object in the environment, the very fact that you might be sitting in a particular moment on your couch in the living room with nothing else happening, which meant there is a space, and in that space something needs to arise, then you could say that you had this thought about doership because it was essentially destiny, because you found yourself sitting in your living room, and because you were sitting in your living room with nothing else to do, and your conditioning prior to that point has been listening to satsangs about doership, a thought then arose, well, I'm not sure that I'm not the doer because I can move my hand to the right. And so if we see that happened because of my conditioning up to that point in time, which was the satsangs you're listening to, the books you're reading, none of which are you really in control of, the content of which is something that life is delivering to you that changes your up-to-date conditioning, that then inspires you to think one way and not another. So seeing all of those impersonal chains of events, and in particular the new conditioning that life delivers each moment that becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning that then inspires a certain type of thinking, maybe will loosen up this belief in personal doership.
Okay, I can see. Thank you very much. I can see I didn't take the analysis far back enough. I was starting with the thought, the intention, I thought. Yeah. So yes, and I've built a whole structure around this, this trying to prove my point, because I also look at repetitive successes that I have in my life. For example, when I prepare a dish and I do it successfully, and I do it 10 times in a row successfully, I conclude from that I must be the successful doer. So yes, I can see that I've been amassing information to prove the point. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very helpful.
Well, what we can say when you make a dish that is successful 10 times in a row is that you can say, I am such programmed instrument by life that is designed to produce this dish successfully. To me, that's more accurate, and it takes away the doership
Yes, yes.
aspect. Yeah.
Good, very helpful.
And one other thing is when you toss a coin 10 times, and 5 out of the 10 times the coin comes up heads, what we might think if we don't look at it closely enough is that I was in, let's say you call heads and 5 times heads comes up, you might think that you were in control 5 times, and the other 5 times when tails came up, you weren't in control. When we look at it more closely, we realize we weren't in control for any of them, for any of the coin tosses. 5 times what you wanted just happened to happen, and 5 times what you wanted didn't happen. And so in the same way, when you have the intention to move your hand, just realize that most of the time, the correlation between a thought and the movement of the body is, there is a strong correlation. There will be a time for some people when they're paralyzed, for example, they have the thought and the hand doesn't move. There will be the experience for some people where the hand jerks without any conscious intention. And so just because we have consistency a consistency of outcome doesn't actually mean that we have control. It just means that there is a consistency of causality, let's say. And that consistency is a tendency, but not necessarily something that is going to be absolute, because at any point new variables can come in and throw a curveball into the mix. You know, you might find that you are cooking with bad eggs one day and the dish doesn't turn out.
Yeah. Yes, I'm very aware that there is a confirmation bias at work in the picture. Yes. Yes.
Good. I'm glad when people start looking at the critical thinking biases, then and becoming aware of them, then that in itself is pretty encouraging.
Thank you. Thank you. Much appreciation.